It is quite common here to witness the arrival or departure of priests who take over new parishes. Although I don't exactly remember when the priest arrived, my mother always says he had been with us for over 15 years. Father Raimundo was very beloved by everyone, although in recent months he had become increasingly absent. He only celebrated Mass in the morning at 6 a.m. and at noon on Sundays, and after that he would isolate himself in his room. The only company he had was the parish secretary, the woman who cleaned his house, and the sacristan. He avoided contact with anyone else. Additionally, his appearance was very frail, with noticeable weight loss and yellowing skin. Many said he was ill, so when we heard that he would be transferred to another parish, the general consensus was that it was for the best, as in a larger place, he could receive the medical care he needed, especially with his health so weakened. When we went to say goodbye to the priest, almost the entire village accompanied us. It was a moment of sadness, but at the same time, we knew that if he stayed with us, he wouldn't last much longer. While we awaited the arrival of the new priest, my mother accompanied me to help her friend, who did the cleaning at the house where the priests lived, next to the church. Since they were longtime friends, my mother didn't hesitate to offer her help with the tidying up. Few people had entered that house in the last few months, so I was very curious. As soon as I entered, I felt an odd sensation in the air, something heavy and uncomfortable. We began to clean the common areas like the living room and kitchen, which were rarely used, so the cleaning wasn't difficult. When it was time to go upstairs to the priest's room, the lady who cared for the house appeared nervous and told us she was afraid to go in. She explained that the priest never allowed her to enter to clean, as she had often heard voices inside the room when no one else was in the house. My mother tried to calm her by suggesting that perhaps he was praying or talking on the phone. However, the lady said the strange thing was that sometimes she heard another voice, as if someone else were there with him. We tried not to think too much about it and proceeded to the room. The place was impeccably tidy but seemed uninhabited. The bed was perfectly made, with a lamp beside it and a crucifix near the headboard. Everything appeared to be in order, but there was something about the atmosphere that made me uncomfortable. The religious images, although respectful, seemed to have a sinister aura. My mother started rummaging through the drawers to check if the priest had left anything behind. When she reached the last drawer, she found a small recorder. She asked her friend if she knew what it was, but the lady said she had never seen that device before. The priest had never mentioned or shown it to her. It looked old, as if he had kept it for years. My mother suggested the recorder be kept just in case someone came looking for it, but no one showed up. We decided to leave it where it was, but the next day, before the new priest arrived, my mother decided to take it back to the house where we had found it. When we returned to the house, my mother's friend was about to open the door. As we tried to hand over the recorder, she took it and, unsure how, pressed a button, and the device started playing. It was the priest's voice. We tried to figure out how to turn it off, but before we could, we started hearing what he was saying. The priest was talking about a confession he had kept for years, and he said he hoped that what he was about to tell would only be heard after his death, as the content of the recording was very serious and confidential. The confession contained answers to many things he could not explain, like his increasingly sick appearance and the strange behavior he had in the past weeks. In the recording, the priest explained that one day, while returning from a mass in a neighboring village, his truck broke down in the middle of the road. With no help in sight, he decided to walk until he found someone. As he was near the village cemetery, he encountered a man but immediately recognized him as the devil. Though he tried not to look at him, the man confronted him, saying that the village already belonged to him and that everything the priest did would be in vain. The priest then tried to pray, but the man's presence paralyzed his body and he couldn't move. The recording continued, and the priest went on, now speaking about other demonic apparitions that began to occur within his own house, in his prayer room. The devil appeared every night and repeated the same words, that the village and its people already belonged to him, and that it didn't matter what the priest did, because everything was already under his control. The priest tried to keep people away from his house to protect them, and with each passing day his body grew weaker. He became thinner, and his skin turned yellow. In the recording, the priest's voice grew weaker, but he still reported that he had asked for help from the bishop and was willing to send a letter to Rome if necessary, to ask for assistance. And that was the last thing we heard before the recorder stopped. The silence that followed in that house was suffocating, and we all stood in silence, stunned by what we had just heard. We hurried out of the house and never knew if anyone else found out about the content of the recording. The village went on with its usual routine, unchanged, And to this day I don't know where the recorder is. Perhaps someone found it and kept it, or perhaps it disappeared. What I do know is that the feeling of discomfort and fear I felt in that house never went away, and the priest's revelation on that recorder remains a mystery to all of us. My name is Karina, and the story I'm about to tell happened when my cousin Daniel was just over 30 years old. Although it may seem like a plot from a soap opera at first glance, what we experienced was far more real and terrifying. Daniel was always a balanced person, dedicated to his work, kind and with strong values. He married young to his childhood friend Laura, and together they built a family that many saw as an ideal example. However, what few knew was that before marrying Laura, Daniel had a brief and secret relationship with our cousin Isabel. Isabel had always been an attractive woman, but she also had an intense and possessive personality. During their teenage years, she and Daniel had a romance that ended quickly because he never took the relationship seriously. To him, it was something temporary, just an experience. However, for Isabel, the relationship became an obsession. Although she never openly showed it, we knew she had never gotten over him. It was a secret kept within the family. But after Daniel married, Isabel disappeared from family visits. For a while, we thought she had moved on, but we soon realized we were wrong. The real story began when Laura started noticing strange changes in Daniel's behavior. It started with small things. He would come home late, seem distracted and be irritable. Over time, his behavior became even more erratic. He began avoiding Laura's company and started having disturbing dreams. He would tell her he saw a beautiful woman riding a horse. She would call him by name and promise him everything he had ever wanted. At first, Daniel thought it was just a strange dream, but these visions started becoming more frequent. Laura, not knowing what to do, called me for advice. I went to their house and noticed how badly Daniel was doing. He looked exhausted, as if he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were hollow and he had a constant confused expression. When I asked him what was going on, he simply said he felt something pulling him to a place he couldn't explain. That's when Isabel reappeared in our lives. She started showing up at family gatherings, always impeccably dressed with a smile that seemed forced. What struck me the most was the way she looked at Daniel. It wasn't a casual glance, it was something deeper, as though she was studying every move he made. Laura, of course, noticed and began feeling uncomfortable. One day during a family lunch, Isabel approached Daniel and started talking to him privately. Laura tried to act like it didn't bother her, but later confessed to me that she felt a chill in her chest seeing them together. Shortly after, Daniel started spending more time out of the house. He said he had too much work. Laura began to suspect he was being unfaithful, but she had no concrete proof. One night, while going through Daniel's clothes, Laura found something that left her in shock. It was a small hand-sewn red fabric bag. Inside, there were dried flower petals, a tuft of hair, and something that looked like dried blood. Laura called me in desperation, and as soon as I could, I went to see what she had found. We both knew it was something far from normal. We decided to take the bag to a woman who practiced certain rituals in the region. When she opened the bag, she turned pale and explained that someone had done a spell to bind Daniel. She told us that the symbol on the bag represented a female entity, a spirit that grants wishes related to love and desire, but at a very high price. The description matched Daniel's nightmares: a beautiful woman on a horse, a symbol of power and control. The woman warned us that this entity could be extremely dangerous because it feeds off the dark desires of those who summon it, but always demands something in return. Laura didn't believe it at first, but when she confronted Daniel, he confessed that Isabel had been secretly looking for him. She would send him messages, call him, and invite him out. At first he resisted, but he felt an irresistible attraction to her. Even when he tried to avoid her, he continued dreaming about Isabel and the figure of the woman on the horse. From that point on, things started to get darker. Daniel began to have panic attacks and felt as though he was being watched constantly. Laura took him to a healer for a spiritual cleansing, but the healer said the spell was too strong and difficult to break because it was tied to a malevolent entity. Things worsened when Isabel started acting more aggressively. One day Laura confronted her, and to our surprise, Isabel didn't deny anything. She admitted to making a pact because she had always loved Daniel and couldn't stand seeing him with another woman. She said she had sought help from a sorcerer and didn't regret it because she believed they were destined to be together. Laura tried to report her, but how do you accuse someone of something like that? They spoke with Isabel's mother, but she simply said she didn't care. Without proof, nothing could be done. Meanwhile, Daniel continued to deteriorate. He stopped working, began having paranoid episodes, and turned to alcohol to calm himself. Finally, he made the most destructive decision of all. He left the house and went to live with Isabel. Laura was devastated, but there was nothing she could do to stop him. Daniel seemed to be under a spell, as if he were trapped in an invisible web. Even though the family tried to bring him back to his senses, he completely ignored us. He became aggressive and wouldn't let anyone finish a sentence. Even though he was still married to Laura, he started spending more time with Isabel, ignoring everyone else. At first, they seemed happy, but soon, problems began to arise. Daniel started waking up in the middle of the night screaming, saying he saw the woman on the horse in every corner of the house. Isabel was getting more and more nervous, as if something was consuming her. Daniel stopped working completely and became entirely dependent on Isabel. His obsession with her turned into dependency, but this unhealthy devotion didn't ward off the dark presence surrounding them. Their fights became constant and violent, even physical. Isabel tried to keep control, but something seemed to be slipping out of her hands. Soon neighbors started talking. They said they heard screams and strange noises coming from the house. Isabel started avoiding going out, and Daniel was hardly ever seen in the streets. To us it was clear that something was wrong, but we couldn't intervene. Laura kept trying to help, but Daniel rejected her, saying that Isabel was the only one who truly understood him. We couldn't understand how such a strong, balanced man had turned into a shadow of himself. Things got worse when a neighbor told us that one night, Daniel left the house barefoot and in his underwear, screaming that the woman on the horse was watching him outside. Isabel followed him desperately, but Daniel refused to return. He sat down on the sidewalk, trembling and crying, repeating that she was coming to get him. The neighbors called the police, but when they arrived, Daniel had already gone back home and refused to open the gate. Isabel began seeking help from other sorcerers, saying she visited dark markets to find protective objects and talismans, but the entity had already become deeply entrenched in their lives. During the nights, strange sounds came from the walls, and some neighbors claimed to have seen shadows moving down the hallways. At one point, Laura decided to return to Isabel's house. She knew Daniel wouldn't let her in, but she wanted to see him and make sure he was okay. When she arrived, Isabel opened the door. Her face looked very different, as if she hadn't slept in days. Her clothes were dirty and worn inside out. Without saying a word, she let Laura in. Inside, Laura found Daniel sitting on the floor, surrounded by lit candles. His gaze was lost and he mumbled incoherent words. Isabel knelt beside him, crying and begging him to react. It was then that Laura noticed something strange. The walls were covered in carved symbols, some marked with what appeared to be blood. When she confronted Isabel, she finally confessed that she had tried to reverse the spell, but the sorcerer had warned her that the entity would require payment. Isabel started crying, saying the entity had been threatening her in dreams, warning her that if she didn't sacrifice something, Daniel would be taken forever. Laura tried to get Daniel out of the house immediately, but he refused, looking terrified. Desperate, Laura called a priest to bless the house, but when he arrived, the priest refused to enter. He said the presence was too strong, and it would require more than just a blessing to face it. Meanwhile, Isabel continued to fall apart. She spent her days locked in her room, barely able to stand when she left. The house began to exude a strange smell like decaying flowers. The plants quickly died and the lights flickered, even when there was no storm. One night, neighbors called Laura, saying that Isabel had run out into the street, screaming that something had entered her house. When Laura arrived, what she saw left her speechless. Isabel was covered in scratches, her face disfigured. Daniel, on the other hand, was lying on the floor unconscious. He was taken to the hospital where they confirmed he was severely dehydrated and malnourished. He spent several days under observation, but when he woke up, he didn't remember much. He said he had been trapped in a dark place where the woman on the horse whispered to him. Isabel was sent to a psychiatric hospital. Her mental state had deteriorated to the point where she didn't recognize anyone. She said something was chasing her, but she couldn't escape. After all this, Laura tried to help Daniel rebuild his life, but he was never the same. They divorced, and now Daniel is cared for by his family. Although he has stabilized somewhat, he still carries the weight of what he went through. Isabel, on the other hand, needs constant sedation or suffers from panic attacks. The house they lived in was abandoned and sold months later. The new owners didn't stay long, claiming the place was cursed, hearing voices and seeing things in the mirrors. Laura and I sometimes talk about what happened, trying to find logical explanations, but we never do. The only thing we know for sure is that one should never mess with forces they don't understand, because they can leave scars that last forever. Have you ever heard of the chupacabra? That legend that was so famous in the 90s, frequently appearing in the radio news. I think we all came to see it as just another folk tale, and for me it always was just a legend, until something happened that made me write to you. Honestly, I hope to receive some sort of response, although I know that most reactions will probably be of disbelief. I am writing to you right now from my grandparents' little house, where I've spent the past few months. It was here that we experienced something that made us revisit this legend. The house is simple, with just 2 rooms, a kitchen and a dining area. I have a small desk set up in a space outside, where I work on my tasks and projects. Since the space is limited, I try to work after 9 p.m. when my grandparents have gone to sleep. The area isn't as rural as it was when my parents grew up here, but we're still pretty isolated. There are only a few small ranches around, and about 2 kilometers away is the highway, next to which 2 luxury housing complexes were built. Life here remains simple, with people still raising animals. We have a dog, 2 goats, 2 pigs, and several chickens. It all started one night when the animals began acting agitated, as if someone had entered the chicken coop to steal a chicken. I got up from the computer and went to check, but I didn't see anything. I went to tell my grandparents that the animals were making strange noises, but they told me not to worry, that no one steals animals around here and the dog wouldn't let anyone get close. I tried to go back to work and let my grandparents sleep, but then I heard a sharp sound from a distance, near the chicken coop, and the dog began barking incessantly. After that, something ran across the roof. I could clearly hear the footsteps, but they were very light, almost like a small animal. That's when my grandparents came out of the room, worried, and asked me if I had heard it too. I said yes, and then my grandfather grabbed an old shotgun I had never seen before. Before I could ask what was going on, we saw the door of the chicken coop moving and some commotion outside. The padlock on the door made it impossible for an animal to open it, so I was sure that someone had entered. My grandfather went out to check, and my grandmother and I stayed by the door. Suddenly we saw the dog dash towards the plantation, not barking as if it was determined to attack. And I swear we saw 2 things running in the field, the dog and something else. We shouted and shouted for the dog, but it didn't return and only came back after a long while, exhausted, as if it had been running the whole time. It came back and tried to drink some water, but then collapsed on the ground, completely spent. My grandmother approached to pet it, and I heard my grandfather ask her if she thought it was the same thing again. She answered yes, and that the dog had gone after it because it didn't know what was following it. That's when they told me the stories about that creature, that monster. They didn't call it the chupacabra, but it was something similar. Back then, sightings weren't as frequent. The creature had attacked the region, but the neighbors decided to keep it quiet. The last thing they wanted was for TV cameras to exploit their losses for ratings. But when this thing started approaching the houses, peeking through the children's windows, that's when they decided they couldn't stay silent anymore. They organized a hunt for the creature. They set up alarm signals, and when one of the neighbors activated theirs, it meant the creature was nearby and everyone would go there. For weeks, this thing fed on the animals in the area, and only 2 people, a child and an elderly man, said they had seen it. They described it as a sort of hairless monkey, child-sized but with huge red eyes, no nose, and teeth so long that they protruded from its mouth, pointed. One night, they almost captured it. They cornered the creature in a barn, surrounded it, and the whole village gathered to make sure it wouldn't escape, since it was keeping everyone up at night. But when they were about to capture it, somehow it was gone. They went inside the barn, but it wasn't there anymore, and then it became just another news item on the radio, something happening on the other side of the country. They kept telling me stories until our dog fully recovered. I think we went to sleep close to 7 a.m. When I woke up, my grandfather had already been out for quite some time. He had gone out early to talk to his friends at the sugarcane mill. That night, they planned to go out and scare the creature, so it would know they were still waiting for it and that they would protect everyone in the area. What I'm about to tell you happened only once. Something approached the house. Something made the dog cry and run off, I swear to you. Something walked along the wooden porch in front of the house. The other animals were visibly terrified. I can't describe the sounds they made, and although my grandfather and I didn't say anything and remained silent, the atmosphere was filled with the terror we both felt. Suddenly we heard the dogs barking, which at a distance seemed to come closer, but then we didn't hear it anymore. We didn't hear the footsteps or any noise from that creature escaping. The dog suddenly appeared and started scratching at the door to be let inside. When we went to let it in, we noticed that the other animals had also calmed down. Whatever it wasn't nearby anymore. My grandfather went out again and returned after midnight, without having seen anything. Since then, we haven't heard anything. It seems like everything has calmed down again. However, from time to time, when the animals start making scared noises, which under normal circumstances we would consider normal, I can't help but think that something is still nearby, watching us from the field. When the dog stays quiet, staring over there, I hope this was just an isolated event and that we don't start seeing more news about this. I work as a security guard in a medium-sized commercial building located in the center of my city, and I will leave this information anonymously here. The crime rates in the area are high, making it quite common for businesses to suffer significant losses due to nighttime break-ins. Normally, I have a colleague working with me, but this month I was alone. As the company I work for was training a new employee, I didn't mind being alone. It was more boring and made it harder to stay awake, but sometimes having a partner could be annoying, depending on who they were. Anyway, I was patrolling the parking lot as usual, when I noticed two men across the street. They were standing in the dark, looking in my direction. I couldn't tell if they were looking at the building or watching me, but it gave me an odd feeling. The next time I did my rounds, they had disappeared. I mentally noted it, but didn't think much about it. The rest of the night was quiet, and I left at 6 a.m. without anything else to report. The following days were also calm, but then, one night at the end of the week, while doing my rounds outside, I saw them again. They were in the same spot, standing in the dark, watching me. I felt uncomfortable again, so instead of continuing my rounds, I stayed on that side of the building, thinking that if they saw I noticed them, they might leave. I stood there walking back and forth for about 5 minutes until the men left. While I was out there, I tried to mentally note what they looked like, but it was hard to distinguish details from that distance. I stayed out there for another 15 minutes after they left, making sure they wouldn't come back. Then I went back inside. With the men out of sight, I thought it would be a good opportunity to go to the break room and have dinner. It was around 1 a.m. The break room was at the end of the hall in the back of the building. I sat at a table and started eating while scrolling through my phone, when suddenly I heard a noise. I dropped my phone and looked toward the hallway door. I had never heard a noise like that before. After a few seconds, I stood up and went to the door. I stood there for about 30 seconds, waiting to hear something, but it was so quiet that I thought it was nothing. I went back and finished my meal. Then I went to the security office to check if there were any alerts or signs. Everything was in order. Normally, this was the time of night when I sat in the chair and waited, but something inside me felt the urge to do another round. The noise hadn't made me nervous. I think I was more curious about what it was, and it gave me something to do while I was bored. I began patrolling the outside, walking around the building. It was quiet, with only the ambient hum of the streetlights. No one was outside. I went back inside and started walking down the building's hallways. Normally, unless there was a sign or an alert on the system, I didn't check every corner of the building. I just walked back and forth in the hallway, making sure nothing was out of the ordinary. The hallway was long and shaped like an L, so it was more like two long hallways. On one side was the main door, and on the other side was a door leading to a small staircase with an emergency exit. It was an old metal door, original to the building. As far as I knew, it wasn't connected to the security system because it was so old. To counter this, the company had put a large lock on it and locked it, making it practically useless. However, when I reached the end of the hall and looked through the window of the door at the staircase, I was completely frozen. The lock was broken in half, and the metal door had been forced open. I felt a chill run down my spine as I rushed back to the security office. If someone had broken in, how the hell did they pass by me unnoticed? Surely I would have seen or heard something. I started reviewing the security footage and got to the point where I was outside, watching the two men. After they left, I stayed there for a while to keep watch. During this time, they circled around to the back of the building, broke the lock, and entered the workrooms. The most disturbing part was that, when I went back inside, they were still in the building. One of them was on the other side of a door, literally 2 meters away from me, while I passed by him and entered the break room. While I was in there, one of them bumped into a table as he tried to hide, which was probably the sound I heard when I went back outside to do my rounds. That's when they fled. In the footage, it was clear that both men were armed, with large knives strapped to their belts. This made me think that they were prepared to face me if necessary. I called the police and handed over the footage, but nothing was done. The quality of the images wasn't great, and the men had their faces covered. The company said several hard drives or files or something like that had been taken, and they seemed quite concerned about it. However, to this day, there have been no further updates on the men or their motivations. And those were today's stories. Have you ever heard any stories similar to the ones told today? Let me know in the comments which of the 5 stories caught your attention the most. If you liked it, don't forget to like and get ready, because in the next video, I'll bring more disturbing stories.